She has lived long enough to see her life turned into a movie, a headline, a costume, a Halloween joke. She has watched people who never met her explain who she was, what she felt, what she knew. She has smiled, corrected small details, let the bigger ones slide. But there is one memory she never casually adjusts, never teases, never leans on for sympathy. It lives behind her eyes, not on the page. It is the one thing that, if she spoke it plainly, would not just change how people see Elvis. It would change how they see her. It does not begin with a fight or a scandal or some explosive confession. It begins in that quiet, almost boring way that real turning points often do. A room, a closed door, a conversation that starts like dozens of others. She is younger than she should be to be carrying so much, and he is already older than his years because the world has taken pieces of him and sold them. To millions, he is a miracle. To her, he is still the man who chose her. That choice used to feel like a fairy tale. On this night, it feels heavier. By now, she knows the house. She knows the rhythm of his moods. She knows when to talk, when to listen, when to read the room and quietly disappear. This is how love works here, not as a partnership of equals, but as a careful dance inside someone else's orbit. She has been taught, gently and not so gently, that her place in that orbit is a privilege. There are so many girls who would have killed to be where she is, they tell her. They say it with a smile, but it sounds like a warning. The memory begins with something small, a request, a decision made for her, not with her. Maybe it is about where she will go. Maybe it is about who she will see. Maybe it is about what she will say in public. It does not really matter what the subject is. What matters is the tone. There is no question in it, no space for her to argue without creating a problem. He is calm, certain, already sure of the answer, her answer. And in that moment, she realizes this is not a discussion. It is a verdict. She feels the familiar tug inside her chest, the one she has learned to ignore. The part of her that wants to say, "I do not want that," or "I am not comfortable with this," or simply "no." That word has become expensive in this world. It costs peace. It costs access. It costs the image of the loving couple the world expects to see. So instead of letting it out, she does what she has done so many times before. She softens her voice. She adjusts her face. She tries to make her discomfort look like agreement. He believes her, or he chooses to. He has his own armor to protect, his own fears of abandonment and betrayal, his own scars that tell him that control is the only way to keep something he loves from slipping away. He might even tell himself he is protecting her, from the world, from rumors, from bad influences. That is the word that comes up often, protection. It sounds kind. It sounds noble. It can hide almost anything behind it. As the conversation goes on, she notices the pattern more clearly than she ever has before. How many times her life has been sorted into categories: allowed, not allowed, encouraged, shut down. How many choices have been made in her name while the world calls her his great love, his partner. She looks at him and feels two realities sitting in the same room: the man she cares about and the structure that quietly keeps her small. For the first time, she understands that loving him and obeying him have been woven together so tightly she can barely tell them apart. There is a moment where she almost speaks. You know that feeling when the words are right there, burning behind your tongue. She takes a breath. Her heart jumps not from romance but from risk. If she says what she truly feels in this moment, the air in the room will change. His eyes might harden. His voice might sharpen. He might retreat, sulk, withdraw affection in that quiet, crushing way that hurts more than any argument. She has seen what happens when he feels challenged. She has seen people pay for it. So instead of the truth, she chooses survival. She nods, she gives a half smile, she says something safe like, "If that is what you think is best." On the outside, it sounds like trust. On the inside, it feels like surrender. It is such a small sentence. It is not dramatic. It is not cinematic. No one around them would have pointed at that moment and said, "That is where everything changed." But she feels it. Somewhere deep in her, a line has been crossed. Later, she will replay the scene over and over. Not because anything terrible happened in the way people define the word. There was no public explosion, no broken glass, no bruises to point to as proof. That is what makes the memory so difficult to explain. It is about the invisible damage, the quiet understanding that her inner voice had been officially overruled, that she had just agreed to something that hurt her because she thought that was the price of staying. She walks out of that room knowing something she did not fully know before. She is not just in love with Elvis Presley. She is living inside the legend of Elvis Presley, and that legend has rules you do not break. You do not contradict the star. You do not expose the cracks. You do not admit that the castle people dream about can feel like a cage from the inside. Her job, she realizes, is not just to be his wife, his partner, his confidant. It is to protect the story. In interviews years later, she will talk about certain things carefully. She will acknowledge the age difference. She will describe being young, guided, shaped. She will use words like groomed only when the world is finally ready to hear them without tearing her apart. But in the early years, the burden is clear. If she names what is happening, she does not just accuse him. She also uncovers her own part in letting it go on. So she collects the moments, hides them in the back of her mind, and learns to walk around them. The memory that haunts her is not just that one conversation. It is what it represents. The realization that she has already given up more than she meant to. That she has let people decide things for her because the price of resistance felt too high. In that room on that night, she sees the shape of the future if nothing changes. A life full of smiling photos and carefully edited answers. A life where every time she senses something is wrong, she stands down in the name of loyalty. From the outside, fans will see only the beautiful parts, the dresses, the home, the access to the most famous man on earth. They will call her lucky. Some will call her opportunistic. Others will romanticize every detail, turning her into a princess in a story written by fate. No one will know the cost of that title except her. No one will feel the weight of that one moment except the woman who had to swallow her truth to keep the fairy tale alive. In that split second between wanting to speak and choosing silence, something inside her shifts. She realizes that her memories are not really hers anymore. They belong to a story bigger than her, a story the world has already decided it loves. If she ever tells them honestly, the story breaks. And when the story breaks, so does the image of Elvis, and so does the image of Priscilla, the loyal, elegant keeper of his flame. Everyone loses something. That is the real reason the memory is dangerous. Not because it reveals a single act of cruelty or an obvious villain, but because it exposes the system underneath the romance, the imbalance, the pressure, the way a young girl can be trained to protect a man even from the truth of what he did to her heart. It is the kind of memory that does not fit neatly into headlines or documentaries. It does not give people an easy side to choose. It makes everyone uncomfortable. Years later, sitting under bright studio lights, she will be asked simple questions with complicated answers. Were you happy? Did you feel loved? Do you regret anything? She will smile, tilt her head, choose each word as if it might detonate. She will tell parts of the story, enough to seem honest, not enough to burn the house down. Viewers will praise her grace. Critics will accuse her of protecting him. Few will understand that there are some things she cannot say without also breaking herself. Because that night, in that room, she made a decision she never fully admitted out loud. She chose to bury a feeling so the world could keep its hero. She chose to stay quiet so the myth could keep breathing. And once you make that choice, it is very hard to go back and rewrite it. The memory becomes a locked door in a house everyone thinks they already know the floor plan of. She can still see it, the exact angle of his face, the sound of his voice as he explained what was best. The way the room felt smaller when she agreed, not because he screamed, not because he raged, but because his certainty left no space for her own. That is the part she cannot shake. Not the details of the decision, but the realization that her feelings were negotiable in a way his never were. If she ever tried to describe it, most people would say, "That does not sound so bad." They would compare it to worse stories, more graphic ones, more obviously abusive ones. They would miss the point. The point is not that this memory is the most shocking thing that ever happened in their relationship. The point is that it was the moment she understood the rules written in invisible ink. The moment she knew what would happen every time her truth collided with his control. And that is why she keeps it guarded. Not because it is too weak to survive the light, but because she knows what that light would reveal about both of them. It would show the world a Priscilla who did not stand up, who did not leave, who participated in her own silencing. It would show an Elvis who needed her to be small to feel safe. It would complicate the legend beyond repair. So she carries it, through the years, through the questions, through the scripts and biopics and debates about who he really was and what she really knew. It stays with her, not as a single scene, but as a permanent understanding. The night she realized she had crossed a line she could never uncross, and the same night she understood why that truth could never fully belong to anyone but her. Because the moment Priscilla Presley finally understood what that memory truly meant was the same moment she knew something even more frightening. The world did not want that version of the story, and if she ever dared to tell it exactly as it lived inside her, it would not just be Elvis Presley's legacy that shattered first. It would be her own. Before there was a memory she wanted to bury, there was a girl who wanted to belong. Long before interviews and headlines and debates about what she did or did not know, there was just Priscilla walking into rooms that were never built for someone her age, trying to act older than she felt. The world would later talk about her as if she walked into Elvis's life with a plan, but the truth is simpler and more uncomfortable. She walked into his orbit the way many young people walk toward a bright light, curious, flattered, a little dazed, willing to believe almost anything that made the feeling last. In the beginning, silence did not feel like a punishment. It felt like being chosen. There was an electricity around him that made everything else seem dull by comparison. People lowered their voices when he entered a room. Men who were feared suddenly became polite. Women who were admired suddenly seemed nervous. He carried a kind of power that made you want to stand up straighter, laugh at the right time, say the right thing. Priscilla watched all of that from the edge at first, amazed that a single person could make a whole environment tilt. When that focus turned on her, it was overwhelming in a way she didn't have words for yet. He noticed her. He asked about her. He listened to her in a way that made her feel visible in a world that usually overlooked quiet, well-behaved girls. The attention itself was intoxicating, and like most intoxicating things, it blurred lines that should have stayed sharp. At first, what he asked of her seemed small. Stay in tonight. Do not go there. Do not talk to this person. Be careful what you say to that one. It was easy to tell herself he was simply being protective. Protective is a word that sounds loving when you are young and used to following rules. Protective sounds like someone is keeping you safe, not keeping you contained. The people around them reinforced that message without even realizing how deep it cut. They would smile at her and say, "You are so lucky he cares this much," when he changed her plans for her. They would joke, "If Elvis told me what to do, I would listen too," whenever he made a decision on her behalf. Some would remind her gently that many girls would trade places with her in a heartbeat. The point was always the same. Being with him was a privilege. Privileges come with conditions. Over time, those conditions taught her a new language. It was not the language of open disagreement. It was the language of quiet adjustments. She learned how to phrase discomfort as gratitude. Instead of saying, "I wanted to go," she learned to say, "Maybe you are right." Instead of saying, "That hurt me," she learned to say, "I understand." Those small changes kept the air calm. They kept the peace. They also taught her that honesty could be dangerous. There were moments when her old self tried to surface. A phone call she was not allowed to make. A friend she stopped seeing. An outfit she was told was not appropriate. Little sparks of protest flickered inside her. Why does this bother me? Why can he do what he wants while I shrink my world smaller and smaller? But those questions never made it far. Each time she tested the edge of his control, she felt the temperature in the room drop. He did not have to shout to make his point. Sometimes all it took was a pause, a look that said he was disappointed, a silence that lasted just long enough to feel like a wall. On other days, it was sweetness that closed in around her, a sudden compliment, an exaggerated apology, a promise that it was all for her own good. The message was always the same. If she would just trust him, if she would just stop questioning, everything would be fine. And for a while, everything did seem fine. From the outside, it looked better than fine. Photographs captured them laughing, touching, walking in sync. Interviews painted them as a great love story sealed by destiny. The more the world celebrated that image, the harder it became for her to admit what it cost to maintain it. How do you say, "I feel controlled," when every magazine insists you are adored? So she began to self-edit before anyone else had to. She checked her own thoughts and rewrote them into something more acceptable. If she felt uneasy about his decision, she told herself it was her inexperience, not his imbalance. If she felt lonely, surrounded by people yet unable to truly speak, she told herself that this was simply the price of being with someone so important. Important people did not live ordinary lives. Ordinary expectations did not apply. Silence settled in stages, not all at once. It showed up late at night, when she lay awake replaying conversations she had not had the courage to finish. It showed up in the way she avoided certain topics because she already knew how he would react. It showed up when she saw other women laugh too loudly near him and felt a flash of something sharp and desperate that she quickly swallowed. She did not want to be seen as difficult. Difficult people did not last long around him. Every time she chose not to say what she felt, the choice got easier. That is the cruel trick of silence. The first sacrifice hurts, the second stings. By the 10th or 20th, it begins to feel like a habit, and habits feel like personality. She stopped asking herself, "Why am I doing this?" and started thinking, "This is just who I am. I am the one who understands him. I am the one who does not make problems." In public, she was praised for that. Interviewers commented on her poise, her loyalty, her grace. Others admired how she spoke of him with such respect, even long after their lives had gone in separate directions. Fans saw her as the ultimate keeper of his memory, the woman who held the keys to the most intimate version of their hero and chose to share only the parts that confirmed what they already believed. They mistook restraint for peace. They did not see the cost. There were rare moments when the pressure inside her nearly forced its way out. Maybe it was after an argument that ended with her apologizing for something she had not started. Maybe it was after watching him entertain a room full of people, only to come home and withdraw into a silence that made her feel invisible. In those cracks between their roles, she sometimes felt the urge to say everything, to point at the invisible lines and name them one by one. But each time something stopped her. Fear, yes, fear of his reaction, fear of what would happen to her if she pushed too far, but also fear of what it would mean if she admitted the truth out loud. Admitting that she felt controlled did not only accuse him, it also forced her to confront how long she had gone along with it, how many small yeses she had given against her own instincts. That kind of reckoning is brutal. It is often easier to keep performing. As the years passed, the idea of speaking honestly about the dynamic between them became more complicated, not less. The world had chosen its version of the story, a romantic tragedy, a complicated but beautiful love. When she did begin to open up carefully about being young and shaped and guided, people split into camps. Some praised her bravery, others accused her of tarnishing his name. In both reactions, she sensed the same truth: they were not ready to hear the whole thing. So she did what she had always done. She told a version of events that felt survivable. She acknowledged enough discomfort to seem genuine, but not enough to demolish the myth. The deepest moments, the ones that truly defined the balance of power between them, stayed unspoken. She kept those for herself, not because they did not matter, but because they mattered too much. Looking back, she could trace the path from that early girl in over her head to the woman who sat in front of cameras decades later. The through line was not the glamour, or the chaos, or even the love. It was the quiet understanding that her voice would always be measured against his shadow. Every time she considered telling the unvarnished truth, she felt that shadow lean over her shoulder, reminding her of the pact she had made with herself long ago. Protect him, and in doing so, protect the version of herself the world preferred. By the time the memory she tried to bury formed its final shape in her mind, the silence around it was not a fresh decision. It was the end result of years of training, years of choosing peace over confrontation, myth over messy reality. She did not need anyone to tell her to keep it to herself. The voice that kept her quiet now sounded like her own. Years later, when she finally tried to explain herself, she did not really change the story. She changed the timing. She revealed just enough once the world had already decided who Elvis Presley was and who Priscilla Presley had been to him. By then, the damage to her youth, to her sense of self, to her right to speak freely, had already settled in. The price of love had been paid in installments, one quiet compromise at a time, until silence itself felt like the only language she truly owned. History likes clean stories. It prefers beginnings that feel faded, middles that feel dramatic, and endings that tie everything together in a way that makes sense. Elvis and Priscilla gave history exactly that for a long time. A young girl swept into the life of a man the world worshipped. A love story that endured distance, pressure, and fame. A heartbreak that arrived right on time. Through all of it, the same image stayed in front of the crowd. Priscilla, composed and loyal, walking a careful line between honesty and devotion. Behind that image sat the memory she carried like a stone in her pocket. It shaped the way she spoke, and the gaps where she chose silence. It guided which questions she answered in full and which ones she softened. Over decades, that private truth did more than haunt her. It quietly built the version of Elvis the world was allowed to keep. A strange thing happens when a person becomes a legend. The individual disappears and a story takes their place. The story becomes so valuable that entire industries rise around it. Films, books, tour, impersonators, estates, merchandise, documentaries. Every one of those things needs a stable narrative to stand on. Elvis was not just a man anymore. He was a product, a symbol, a myth. A myth like that cannot survive too many unstable details. Someone is always assigned the job of keeping the edges smooth. Priscilla became that person almost without realizing it. She loved him. She had shared rooms with him that no one else had seen. That alone made her the closest thing the world had to a last word on who he really was. Every time she stepped in front of a microphone, her words did more than describe her life. They gave the myth permission to continue. When she chose to highlight his charm, his pain, his vulnerability, millions accepted it as truth. When she gently skirted around the harsher parts, the world followed her lead as well. Audiences did not just listen to what she said. They watched what she left unsaid and took that absence as confirmation that the story could remain beautiful. That is the pressure of being linked to a legend. Every sentence becomes a decision about which version of reality deserves to live. The memory she tried to bury sat squarely in the middle of that responsibility. If she spoke it out loud, even once, that single moment would open the door to a much more uncomfortable picture. People would begin to connect dots she had spent years keeping separate. They would question the power balance. They would revisit the timeline with sharper eyes. They would ask why a young girl had to carry the cost of a grown man's damage. She knew all of that. She had seen what happened when other women in other stories tried to tell their truths about famous men. Many were called liars. Many were called bitter. Many had their entire lives picked apart in search of reasons not to believe them. Priscilla understood that stepping fully into that kind of confession would not only alter Elvis's image, it would drag her own choices into the harshest light possible. There is another layer that made the silence even more complicated. After he died, grief did something that control never managed to do. It made her protective in a different way. Whatever he had been to her in private, to the world he was gone now, defenseless, frozen in time, the boy from Tupelo, the king who burned out too early. Fans wept in front of gates and bought every scrap of memory they could find. In that wave of mourning, she felt something rise inside her that sounded like a promise. Whatever truth she carried, she would not hand it over to a world that might use it for spectacle. That promise gave her a strange kind of purpose. She could keep watch over what remained. She could decide which stories served the legacy and which stories would only feed a hunger for scandal. That role gave her power. It also locked the door tighter around the memory she did not know how to live with. Time moved on. Cultural conversations changed. People became more willing to question old stories. Viewers began to notice the parts of her interviews where her eyes shifted, where her hands stilled, where a single phrase hinted at something larger. Some felt sympathy, others pushed for more. They wanted details, confessions, a clear label to place on what she had experienced. Was it grooming? Was it abuse? Was it romance complicated by era and expectation? The world loves labels because they give an illusion of understanding. For Priscilla, none of those words could hold the full complexity of her life. The memory she carried was not a single crime scene. It was a living symbol of everything that had been right and wrong at the same time. It was the moment she understood how deeply she had been shaped. It was also the moment she understood how much she had participated in that shaping. Saying it out loud would invite people to dissect both halves without mercy. So she chose a different path. She stepped slowly into more honesty, but she did it on her own terms. She admitted that she had been young. She acknowledged that he had crafted her appearance, her habits, her world. She allowed the word groomed to sit in the air long enough for people to feel its weight. However, she never poured out every memory that justified it. She let the audience fill in some of the blanks. That way, she could finally name the shape of the dynamic, without giving up the last private corner of herself. In that balance, the buried memory found a new purpose. It became the line she would not cross even for the sake of a perfect confession. The world could know that things were not as simple as the fairy tale suggested. It could even know that she suffered, that she lost pieces of her own youth in the process of being near him. It could never receive the one moment that burned all those realizations into her for good. That was the part she chose to keep. Why would someone do that? Why keep the most important truth locked away when telling it might finally release years of pressure? The answer says more about human nature than it does about fame. People do not always tell the whole story, not because they enjoy protecting others, but because they are afraid of what the full truth will say about them. Priscilla's silence protected his image, yes. It also protected the younger version of herself who stayed, who smiled, who said yes, who believed love and sacrifice were the same thing. In the end, the memory became less about Elvis and more about legacy in a wider sense. Not just his legacy as a performer. Her legacy as a woman who survived a life that looked like a fantasy from the outside and felt more complicated than she could explain on the inside. She understood that once she gave that memory to the world, she would never get it back. It would be debated, twisted, doubted, used. Strangers would argue about what it meant as if they had been in the room with her. That thought alone was unbearable. So she made a choice that many people in her position quietly make. She decided that some memories can live more truthfully in silence than they ever could as stories. She let that moment stay between her and the girl she had been. She let it guide how she spoke about power, about age, about control, without holding it up as evidence. The legacy that mattered most to her now was not the perfect picture of a marriage. It was the warning buried inside the parts she did not say. Viewers who listen closely can feel that warning even if they never hear the full story. It is there in the way she talks about being watched. It is there when she describes isolation in the middle of luxury. It is there when she says that girls need to understand their own value before stepping into someone else's dream. The buried memory speaks through those cautions more loudly than any graphic confession ever could. That is what makes her silence so unsettling and so powerful at the same time. It asks a harder question than, "What did he do?" It asks, "What are we willing to excuse in the name of love, and whose voice do we sacrifice to keep our favorite stories intact?" Every fan who insists that the fairy tale must remain untouched becomes part of the reason a woman like Priscilla thinks twice before opening up certain rooms of her past. Some people will always argue that the truth should be total, that every hidden moment must be dragged into the light so people can properly judge it. Others will argue that legacies deserve protection, that the good a person did should not be destroyed by their worst choices. Priscilla lives somewhere in between those extremes. She has given enough of the truth for people to see the outline of what really happened. She has also claimed the right to keep one memory for herself. That decision does not make her weak. It does not automatically make her complicit. It makes her human. Human beings carry contradictions. They can love someone deeply and still feel harmed by them. They can know a situation was wrong and still miss parts of it. They can want justice and still fear what justice will expose in their own reflection. Priscilla's buried memory lives in that complicated space that uncomfortable honesty occupies. In the end, the legacy that survives is not the one fans argued over in comment sections. It is the quieter message hidden inside the way she speaks now. Young listeners hear that she was not as powerful as the photos made her look. Older listeners hear the regret in her pauses. Anyone who has ever stayed silent to keep the peace hears something familiar. The sound of a person who finally understands what happened to them, but still weighs every word because they know some truths change everything. Some memories are not buried because they are lies. They are buried because they are too true and the world that receives them is not gentle. For Priscilla Presley, the memory she tried to bury forever has already done its work. It reshaped how she sees her past. It reshaped how she talks about him. It reshaped how she warns others. The rest of us are left with the outline, the hints, the implications, and an unsettling realization of our own. If even she cannot bring herself to tell it fully, then maybe the real question is not what exactly happened in that room. A more honest question might be this: how many of our most beloved legends are standing on stories that someone somewhere has decided the world is simply not ready to hear? If this story changed the way you see Priscilla Presley, you are not alone. Many people are only now starting to hear the quiet parts between her words. If you want more untold moments like this, hidden behind famous names and polished legends, stay with this channel. Subscribe, share this story, and ask yourself how many truths are still living in silence just to keep the myth alive.